What's up on Nick in the Afternoon? Something really big! Well, kind of. You might want to stay tuned for details.
I talked about a Nickelodeon show a few weeks ago, and before that I mentioned something that was created at Nick Studios Florida, and both of those times really got me in the mood to talk about the place and the troubled history of it. I'm preparing for this video to be a little long because there's a lot to cover, so get ready to take a dive into the world of slime and scandal. This is the history of Nick Studios Florida at Universal Studios Orlando. I'm gonna assume you know what Nickelodeon is, but I'm gonna speedrun an explanation real quick. Nickelodeon, usually referred to as Nick, is a kids television network that broadcasts both live and animated children's programming, aiming for a tween to teen audience. Officially launched in 1979, the younger child-oriented channel would only feature a variety show, Pinwheel, that featured multiple live and animated skits and songs. Much like Sesame Street, minus the puppets for the most part. Over the years, Nickelodeon would develop a more original and unique identity, seeing a peak in the 80s and leaning into what the channel is known for now, both animated and live comedy-based content in the 90s. Over the years, Nick has produced multiple hits, namely SpongeBob SquarePants, Rugrats, and Avatar: The Last Airbender, iCarly, Drake and Josh, and all that, just to name a very small few. While the channel arguably saw its peak from the late 90s into the early 2010s, it still exists now and continues to put out shows, although not to as huge of an audience as what it saw in its peak years. But in terms of what we'll be discussing, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Such success could only have been spurred by the channel's heavy-hitting live programming in its early years, and this programming needed a place to be created, and what better place than a studio located at the upcoming Universal Studios Florida. In 1988, just as Nickelodeon was about to hit a seemingly endless upward stride, the network signed a contract with Universal Studios Florida, which hadn't yet been built, I might add, to inhabit a studio there as the first studio with the Nickelodeon title to create their shows. Prior to this, they would air shows that were recorded elsewhere in non-affiliated studios. This one was meant to be the home to all things falling under the umbrella of Nick's characteristic wackiness. What Universal would gain from this was park attendees, guests curious about how the studio process worked. For a theme park based on movies and the creation of film in and of itself, this was a perfect setup to draw in a crowd. It also helped that part of the negotiation stated that Nick had to advertise the park on their channels.
You can go to Nickelodeon Studios!
Why just sit there when you can go to Nickelodeon Studios? Buds and sits are getting packed. Mom is making up a great big snack singing Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon.
How do we get there?
I don't know. It's right on the map. Come on, let's go. Nickelodeon.
Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, Florida. You can go there.
To make sure that Nickelodeon would feel perfectly at home in the studio, they promised them one to be custom built to the network's needs, and even offered it to them free of a rental cost. Possibly because they feared that Nick might turn around and try to make a deal with the then young Disney MGM Studios. What a nightmare that would be today. Like, could you imagine if that partnership led to SpongeBob being a Disney-owned franchise? Steven Hillenburg would be just as upset about the treatment it got, if not more. The studio would encompass 2 sound stages as well as a video production facility built into the same building or area. The studios would find its home in Production Central, the portion of the park dedicated to attractions based on, like it might suggest, film production. Because the network didn't have a place all its own to produce content, the years preceding this are pretty void of what we consider to be the Nick identity. A lot of the stuff they would broadcast was either created in rented studios, or first created by others and contracted to be broadcast on the channel. Having a dedicated Nick studio allowed the network to create things on its own terms, experiment, and create a larger mass of content at a lesser cost than if they'd tried to do it solely on rented stages. This is why around the time of its opening and into the studio's lifespan, we start seeing more of the channel's iconic game shows and sitcoms. In the meantime of the studios being built, Universal would offer for Nickelodeon to film some things on their existing studios. Stuff like Super Sloppy Double Dare? Super Sloppy. I don't like that. The studios would officially open up to the public in 1990, with the first thing technically being filmed there being the celebration of the opening day events, which was broadcast live from the studios.
Just sit back, hide the remote control, and take a look at the new place where you belong. Live from Orlando, Florida, It's the amazing 3-hour Nickelodeon Studios opening day celebration. Here is Mark Summers.
Welcome to the Nick Studios, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. First time in 11 years we're doing a live broadcast on Nickelodeon, and it means we are coming to you from our new home right here in Orlando, Florida. These are your studios where you can come to watch Nick being made, and you can audition to be on a Nick show.
Since the studios were now open, this meant two things: that the network could begin filming there, and that tours would now be offered to park guests. The tours would last around 45 minutes and would, as promised, take guests through the studios and give them a better idea of what the production of Nickelodeon's shows, and shows in general, was like. First, going through what usually occurred in a day at the studios, a lot of the time the more common filming schedule surrounded game shows. Game shows made up an oddly big portion of Nick's programming both before and into the years at the studios, with Double Dare being the most popular of these game shows. Game shows would take up 5 days of the 7-day week in terms of filming, while other non-competitive and scripted live shows would rehearse on those days and film on the weekend. The touring would take guests through multiple parts of the studios and explain the workings of each, including the video production building, the second floor's control room, the wardrobe department, the part of the studio dedicated solely to concocting the slime and icky stuff used in game shows dubbed the GAC kitchen, and most importantly through a viewing area that allowed guests to see into the sound stages, stages 18 and 19, before ending in an audition room. As a part of the agreement with Universal, however, guests were to be allowed to view shows being filmed at all times that touring was available, and in a picky semantic sort of way, this wasn't completely lived up to, as shows weren't technically being filmed all the time. Game shows would shoot at a rather fast pace, 5 days a week, and once this filming was done for all of the network's game shows, the studio wouldn't actively be filming anything during weekdays for a good portion of the year. You would be lucky to catch a sitcom filming during the weekend if you missed the rather narrow month or so time frame in which a specific game show would be filmed during the week. To make Universal happy, the studios would rename the audition room to Stage 17 and appease guests with a mock game show at the end of the tour where one guest would get slimed. Lucky jerk. Other than tours and filming, a few notable events would take place at Nick Studios Florida that both guests in the park and sometimes viewers at home could enjoy. The first of these came later in 1990, the first year of the studio's operation. Right before the studio's front facade would be built a giant fountain dubbed the Slime Geyser, or the GAC Geyser, depending on who you ask. 17 feet high, the fountain would spray out green-colored water at certain points of the day, specifically every 10 minutes. No word on whether this water was recycled by the geyser throughout its operation for the day. I would think that it would be a big waste of water to do that every 10 minutes and not recycle it. The ceremony unveiling the fountain would be broadcast live on the channel, and a recording of the geyser erupting would be used as the channel's sign-on for a time. I just wanted to also mention that there are still images taken by guests and staff at the actual ceremony, and a set of such images was posted on Twitter in 2019, where a very intellectual conversation about them broke out, featuring the thought-provoking lines, "It's wrapped up like a redneck Christmas present," and "Why does it look like a penis?" Another event you may be more familiar with, the burying of the Nickelodeon time capsule, took place in 1992, and was also broadcast live on the channel. At this event, a time capsule was buried near the previously unveiled slime geyser and contained things that the viewers of Nickelodeon had voted on, things that had a certain importance for that time period. Included in this time capsule were multiple toys such as a Barbie doll, a Game Boy, and a skateboard, different types of books on history and endangered animals, a phone book and a TV guide, CDs and VHS tapes, clothing, news reports on culturally relevant topics such as the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the AIDS epidemic, and Desert Storm, photos of celebrities and politicians, and of course some Nickelodeon-related items such as some GAC, a Nick magazine, a t-shirt with Ren and Stimpy on it, a tape of the burial ceremony, and the camcorder used to record said tape. The time capsule would be buried on grounds right outside the studios, not to be opened until 50 years had passed. Given that math, the time capsule won't be opened until 2042, a good 20 years from now, considering that they'll open it on the day of 50 years passing. Lastly, in 1994 and 95, Nick's annual Nick, or treat, I'm not saying it any faster, I'm better than that, would be hosted at Nick Studios, Florida. Nick, or Treat, was a Halloween block on the channel that would give away prizes. That's kind of it. For the first year that it was aired in 1985, the block would give away many prizes provided by sponsors such as Playschool, M&M's, Sunkist, Pizza Hut, and McDonald's over the years. However, the biggest years for the block are considered to be 1994 and 95, when it was hosted at Nick Studios, Florida. Nick pulled out all the stops, making the block more competitive and game show-like, rather than the typical call-in or mail-in format of the years preceding these two. Fred Newman would host the block and would regularly take a call from a viewer who would sort of compete against the animated monsters from Real Monsters, and yeah, I'm gonna say it like that for the rest of the video. Virtually going door to door between 6 houses, collecting prizes from the monsters if their house had one to offer. Most of the prizes were either unremarkable compared to the previous year's prizes, or Real Monsters related, or both, with a few standouts being a new TV for one winner, and Knuckles' Chaotix for the Sega Genesis as part of the more normal prizes. Moving on, this video is meant to highlight the operations that Nickelodeon had going on in Florida, so for most things, in most ways, Florida was kind of a home to Nickelodeon, rather than the hoity-toity Hollywood in California. This would end up bringing both a lot of good to Florida, but in trade, Florida would sort of give Nickelodeon a lot of its bad. In 1993, the show Roundhouse, a variety show that was produced by Nickelodeon and filmed at the studios, moved their production from Nick Studios, Florida to CBS Studio Center in Los Angeles, California. After the show's cast, who had unionized, became unhappy about the lax regulations in Florida that meant they would receive no residuals for their work. Understandably so, I might add. While this is the only publicly available recollection of negative business practices at Nick Studios, Florida, the overall practices regarding child actors and a certain producer who will not be named were abysmal at other studios. There are multiple public statements against the treatment of child stars both at Nick Studios and other network studios, and even though none of these statements come from anyone involved in work done at Nick Studios, Florida, I wanted to mention it anyway, just because of the proximity to the issue. By early 1994, Nick Studios, Florida had grossed over $110 million in business for the good old state of Florida, $225 million today, and held a staff of anywhere between 280 and 350 people. Universal Studios Florida, on the other hand, was seeing numbers they weren't all that proud of. See, USF, if you don't mind me calling him that, was built because Disney MGM Studios was doing the same kind of thing at Walt Disney World, taking guests behind the scenes of what Disney was producing, as well as the general art of movies such as what MGM had created. Universal was an entire park dedicated to a single concept that only made up a part of a bigger park. So can you take a wild guess of how drastic of a difference in revenue there was between the two? Not a lot of people would admittedly attribute the same amount of magic to Back to the Future as they would a classic film like what was on display at Disney MGM. Universal only made about $8 million, a drastic difference compared to Disneyland's nearly $29 million revenue for that year, which would be like $15 million versus $56 million nowadays. By the next year, in 1995, Universal wanted to take the steps necessary to improve their competition against Disneyland. They had decided to switch gears on the concept of Universal Studios as a whole. While they did offer some rides based on the company's movies, more emphasis was put on allowing guests to experience the creation of these productions firsthand. This drew in some people, but not as much as Disney MGM or even just Disneyland before the fact of MGM. A swap of importance between touring and rides was put into effect, so the park underwent a $2 billion expansion, which would be double that price tag today. The expansion would primarily feature the addition of the Islands of Adventure Park, which encompassed 8 islands, quote-unquote, based off of multiple IPs, both of Universal's ownership and those that had been licensed for use in the park. The rides at this park would be more in the thrill ride category than their previous rides, having more the vibe of Six Flags than Disneyland. 1995 had admittedly seen a slowing in production at Nickelodeon Studios and Universal Studios, but this was also true for Disney. 1995 also, in part, marked the beginning of the end of live-action Nickelodeon productions as we knew them, with Rugrats reruns seeing huge viewership numbers for whatever reason, prompting Nickelodeon to both produce more episodes of this show and give more animation a chance, focusing more attention on that category, which we know would eventually make up a giant amount of their most famous programming. At this time, the animation department for Nickelodeon, responsible for creating their original Nicktoons, was located in Los Angeles, And the increase in budget for this department also meant that a new studio was in order for the animators, the way that the live-action productions got when Nick Studios Florida was created. Also during this time is a request that production of the popular comedy sketch show, All That, have its production moved from Florida to California, so the actors didn't have to migrate every time the show was being filmed, a request which Nickelodeon gave the go-ahead, causing the production to leave Nick Studios Florida and be filmed instead at Paramount Pictures, while Nickelodeon aimed to establish their own studio in Hollywood. The switch of focus onto animation and the slowing of live-action productions, combined with many other unfortunate changes, meant that things were beginning to go downhill for Nickelodeon Studios Florida. By 1996, the president of Nickelodeon had stepped down, the general manager of the studios also quit, with both being replaced fairly quickly, although the effects of both of these changes were felt just as quickly. Not only this, but production at NSF in and of itself was beginning to hit rough waters. In 1997, the production of a live-action show that was filmed there, The Mystery Files of Shelby Woo, was brought to a complete halt by a labor strike, with the crew and creators citing the studio switching the show's production from videotape to film stock as one of the primary reasons why, also noting the abysmal weather of Florida and the lack of local talent as reasons why filming would be much preferable elsewhere. The final season of the show's filming was moved out of NSF to Canada following the strike. 1998 brought on the opening of the aforementioned Nickelodeon studios in Hollywood, with the live-action Nickelodeon on Sunset having been created a year prior and a dedicated animation studio, Nickelodeon Animation Studio, being opened the year following. To give itself more strength in the infighting between Nick Studios Florida and the newly created studios, the technology in the video production center of NSF would be upgraded with the help of the visual effects company Kinetics. In 1999, the network would launch Nick Games and Sports, better known as Nick Gas, where they would rerun the old game shows produced at NSF. New interstitials would also be created at the studios for the new channel. Although this was a good effort, the launch of this channel would come much too late in the game, as the interest in and creation of Nick's signature game shows would have more than begun to dwindle at this point. Things got so bad that in March of 2001, right before things were about to get much worse for Universal and Nick Studios Florida, the studios would lay off many employees who were by then unneeded, as a lot of the productions once housed there had moved to the much favorable California studios, and animation was beginning to hit huge strides, especially after Nick had so recently awakened the beast that is SpongeBob SquarePants. The studios had unofficially admitted defeat, auctioning off any props they didn't need for any of the house's final productions, the last of which was Nickelodeon Splat, an interstitial show for a block of the same name for the Nick channel.
It's a bullseye on Austin's butt, 2,000 points to the team that gets it. They've got to nail him like that, alright?
In April of 2005, Nickelodeon Studios Florida officially closed its doors. Prior to the announcement of the closure, a video was made compiling the many things that were made at Nick Studios Florida, including some things that the public never did get to see, such as the ever-popular Me and My Friends. It documented the years in which what was made, and holds that kind of Nick heart that the studios embodied. While the closure didn't mean that live action was done forever for Nickelodeon, it was bittersweet to admit that the productions were leaving that place that so many of them had called their home for years on end. It was an admission that the era of Nickelodeon that had made the studios so fun and interesting was now over. The slime geyser at the front of the studios was shut off and removed within the next month, and was one of the first iconic markings of Nick Studios Florida to be removed. This was followed by the removal of the Nickelodeon sign that the building donned at its entrance, effectively removing all notable Nick-related appearance to the building, which was now hardly any different from a normal building, lacking the life and whimsy that the building featured in the closing credits of so many of Nick's shows had. After this, the final piece of Nick's history there, the Nickelodeon time capsule, was moved in 2007 from NSF to the Nick Hotel and reburied on the grounds there. The hole left behind by the capsule was later covered over with a concrete slab. In 2006, part of the building, namely Stage 18, was converted to a theater in which the Blue Man Group would claim a residency, to be opened in 2007 and run up until 2021. In 2012, YouTuber Adam the Woo was able to get into the vacant remnants of Nick Studios Florida, showing off a detailed tour of the now years abandoned Stage 19 and video production building, which still contain the mark of a Nickelodeon state of mind. Many, if not all of these murals and decorations have since been removed, in order to make the spaces more unnotable and therefore generic enough for someone else to move in and use them. The spaces in this video are now occupied by a sports network local to Florida, Bally Sports Florida. It's a sad sight to see Nick Studios go, but we have parts of so many good things that came out of it, some that remain and some that don't. I do hope that one day we'll see this kind of childlike wonder be made accessible to the public again in the way that Nick Studios Florida allowed. But with kids networks and networks in general, trading hands so much and becoming more and more corporate by the day, and with Nickelodeon in particular seeing only a fraction of its highest numbers, it's more likely we'll never see anything like this again, as much as I hate to say it. As someone who was only just born when NSF closed, it's really sad that I never got to see it myself. I can only imagine what it was like for people who did, and had to see what became of both the studios and that bygone era of Nickelodeon. It's something I try to live over and over again, but I just can't seem to get any closer to. That's what this channel has always been for, and having talked about NSF just means that I finally covered one of the things that influences how I want my channel to feel. Nickelodeon might not think that NSF meant all that, no pun intended, to a lot of people, but its lasting impression on people even as young as myself is definitely a case for the opposite.
This episode of Sepro was filmed in front of a live studio audience at Nickelodeon Studios, Florida.
As well as the general art of movies such as MemGM. The switch of focus onto animation and the slowing of live-action productions, combined with many other unfortunate changes, meant that things were beginning to go downhill for Nickelodeon. It documented the years in which what was made and holds that kind of Nick heart that the studios embodied. My voice is cracking.